Good morning, everyone. Good morning. My name is Michael Kugelman. I am the Deputy Director of the Wilson Center's Asia program, and I'm also our Senior Associate for South Asia. Thank you all for coming on what appears to be one of the warmest days we've had in a few days, a few weeks. For those of you who may be here for the first time, just a very quick word about the Wilson Center. We are chartered by Congress as the official memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. The Wilson Center serves as the nation's key nonpartisan policy forum for tackling global issues through independent research and open dialogue to inform actionable ideas for the policy community. And in the spirit of President Wilson, the only U.S. president to have held a PhD, as I'm sure some of you knew, we build a bridge between the worlds of academia and public policy to inform and develop solutions to the nation's problems and challenges. The topic of today's conference is religious freedom and the plight of religious minorities in South Asia. These are very salient concerns these days in South Asia, but quite frankly, they are as well in many other parts of the world, including right here in the US, and I don't think any of us would or should deny that reality. I'd argue that questions about religious freedom, particularly when considered in the context of broader themes like intolerance, rising nationalism, have really become one of the great global concerns of our time. So our conference will be looking at how history, and particularly constitution making in a series of South Asian countries, have helped contribute to the current state of affairs involving religious freedom. And we've assembled a very impressive group of experts from the academic and policy worlds to weigh in on these matters. So you all have or should have an agenda in front of you, as you'll have a sense of how we plan to proceed today. In just a few minutes, we'll launch into our morning panel. We'll then have a lunch break, and the food will be served buffet style right out in the atrium outside. You can serve yourselves and then return in here to eat as you please. We'll resume with our afternoon panel at around 2 p.m., and then we should conclude at around 4 p.m., hopefully before the bad weather, if it comes, actually arrives. Now, no one has come here to hear me today, but before I step away, just wanted to thank two very important people. First, I'd like to recognize my colleague, Niti Nair, a Wilson Center fellow who you'll hear from in just a bit when she chairs our morning panel. Niti deserves a huge share of credit for this conference. She and I had discussed this idea for the first time quite some time ago, many months ago. But she really took the idea and ran with it in a big way to develop what I feel is a brilliantly conceptualized conference with an equally brilliant group of speakers. Niti, in addition to being a very gifted scholar, is an exemplary Wilson Center Fellow. She's very engaged with program staff like myself and directly contributes to our activities in a big way. So Niti, thank you very much for your support and leadership with this conference. And I should say, if this conference goes well, which it will, Niti deserves all the credit. But if there's some type of problem for whatever reason, you could all blame me. In the coming weeks, the papers presented today will be published in a special issue of the journal Asian Affairs. And this brings me to the second very important person to thank. Bijan Amrani, who you will hear from in a few moments, is the editor of Asian Affairs, a preeminent journal of Asian studies. And as you see from his bio, he's a bit of a modern-day Renaissance man. Not only is he a journal editor, he's also an historian, a classicist, which is a term you don't hear uttered much inside the Beltway. He's an expert on Afghanistan, Central Asia, and classical history, and he's also a known writer of Latin verse. The Wilson Center is delighted and honored to be partnering with Bijan and Asian Affairs. Asian Affairs is published by Taylor and Francis. It's the flagship publication of the Royal Society of Asian Affairs, and I'd like to offer my gratitude to the Royal Society and to Taylor and Francis for their generous support for this conference and for helping make it possible. Also, I'd like to thank Lawrence Goodchild, Area Studies Managing Editor at Taylor and Francis, as well as Michael Ryder of the Royal Society for their assistance and support. Thank you. With that, please do feel free to live tweet this conference. The wireless password I had thought is on the wall. It's on the wall somewhere. We'll get it to you if you need it. But please do live tweet throughout the day. And with that, I will like to recognize Bijan to come up and offer a few words. Thank you.
Michael, thank you very much for your warm introduction. I'm afraid it was a bit chilly for me to write a Latin epigram to start the conference, so I'll spare you all of that. But I just want to say a few words as editor of the Asian Affairs Journal. And I'm here to represent not only the Asian Affairs Journal, but the Royal Society for Asian Affairs in London, whose journal it is, and also the journal's academic publishers, Taylor and Francis. The Royal Society for Asian Affairs was founded in 1901, and its founder members include people like Lord Curzon and Francis Younghusband. It was set up in London to provide a forum for discussion originally about Afghanistan and Tibet and Central Asian regions in the context of the struggle between Britain and Russia for imperial primacy in Central Asia, part of the Great Game. Certainly over the course of the 20th century, it's moved away from these imperialist and colonialist origins, and its function very much now is to inform and educate and provide a space for discussion about all of Asia from the Middle East to Japan. And the Society is a network of around 1,000 scholars, diplomats, foreign policy practitioners, business people, and other people with a more general interest in Asia. And it functions both giving public lectures, discussion groups within universities and even schools, providing that forum for education and information about Asia. And the journal, of which copies are provided free outside, and you can also download free issues back to 1914 from when the journal was originally published. The journal is an integral part of our mission. It's now appearing 4 times a year, and it's aimed not only at an academic audience, but an audience of practitioners, people in the diplomatic and political worlds as well. So it's a very hopefully stimulating, interesting and readable journal that looks at ideas of policy as well as current affairs and more recent history. And it's very much, although we're a royal society, we're a very independent-minded group of thinkers. So just one particular example, our former chairman, Sir Harold Walker, in 2002, 2003, although recently having stepped down as British ambassador to Iraq, led the critique in the British establishment against the international invasion of Iraq, which took place later in 2003. So very independent-minded we see ourselves as being. And as such, the journal likes to promote a diversity of viewpoints, not just from Britain, but very much from around the world, from people at every level, from ambassadors. So the most recent issue has a piece by Sir Jeremy Greenstock, the former British permanent representative at the UN, all the way to graduates and postgraduate scholars. So in that context, it's very exciting to be able to have the opportunity to sponsor and support this conference, and I'm very much looking forward to being able to publish the papers that proceed from it and listening to the discussion that comes from it. So may I thank the Woodrow Wilson Centre and especially Michael Kugelman and especially Nisi Nair for who did the real hard work in bringing all of this together. And without any further ado, may I invite Dr. Nisi Nair to start the proceedings. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming on this lovely day. My first thanks go to my colleague Michael Kugelman for recognizing the importance of this conference when I first proposed it, especially its comparative dimensions, and for his incredible help through every stage of the process. I'd also like to thank Joshua Spooner with the camera and Mary Ratliff of the Asia program, and our interns Atif Ahmed and Abdullah Wasti. I'd also like to thank Bijan Umrani of Asian Affairs and Lawrence Goodchild of Taylor and Francis for their generous support in co-sponsoring the conference. We're really fortunate to have with us today a truly remarkable lineup of experts, each of whom has spent decades researching their subject. Our first speaker this morning is Mridu Rai, Professor of History at Presidency University, Kolkata. She is author of the award-winning book Hindu Rulers, Muslim Subjects, Islam, Rights and the History of Kashmir, and of various articles in academic and popular publications. I'd like to add that when I first visited Srinagar in 2010, bookshops was well stocked with her book, which was very prominently displayed and was described to me as a bestseller. With Hindu Rulers, Muslim Subjects, Rai has pioneered a new wave of scholarship on Kashmir. She will be joining us on Skype. Our next speaker, Farhanaz Ispahani, is a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center and a senior fellow for South and Southeast Asia at the Religious Freedom Institute in Washington, D.C. She has recently authored a book on Pakistan's religious minorities titled Purifying the Land of the Pure, a history of Pakistan's religious minorities. Ispahani has served as a member of Pakistan's parliament from 2008 to 2012, where she was on the Foreign Relations and Human Rights Committees and was a member of the Parliamentary Women's Caucus. She spent her early career as a print and broadcast journalist. Our next speaker, Dina Siddiqui, is Professor of Anthropology at Brak University, Bangladesh, and a fellow at the Center for the Study of Social Difference at Columbia University. She's the author of numerous publications on human rights in Bangladesh and on gender and labor in Bangladesh's garment factories. She's on the editorial board of Routledge's Women in Asia publication series and on the advisory council of the South Asian Network of Gender Activists and Trainers, Sangat. Our final speaker for the morning panel is Professor Christina Fink, Professor of Practice of International Affairs at George Washington University. She has combined research, teaching, and international development work throughout her career. For the past 20 years, the focus of her work has been on Myanmar state-society relations. She's the author of Living Silence in Burma, Surviving Under Military Rule, and of numerous other publications. Thank you all. And I think we'll begin with Professor Mridu Rai on Skype. Thanks.
First, I'd like to begin by thanking the Center, Royal Society of Asian Affairs, Michael Kugelman, and especially Niki Nair for organizing this event and for inviting me to participate in it despite 8,080 miles of separation today. And thank you, Niki, for those very warm words. I'm not sure, is that voice echo?
It's breaking.
Yes, it is.
You need to help.
There's a slight break.
Should I just power on?
I think, yeah, power through. Yeah. Some
Okay.
words are softer than others.
Let's try, all right? Okay, while the Indian Constituent Assembly, to which I will refer as the CA, had begun its labors on 9th December 1946, Jammu and Kashmir, to which I will refer henceforth as JNK, only became the subject of substantive discussions from 27th May 1949. The delay was caused by the disturbances besetting the region, not least the recent India-Pakistan war, precisely for control over the state's territories, which had ended only months earlier on the 1st of January 1949. By the time JNK appeared on the roster of business, as Gyanendra Pandey has shown, an understanding of the nation as Hindu at its core and a concomitant suspicion of Muslims had become manifest among several of the Assembly's members. Among others, Vallabhbhai Patel, the Deputy Prime Minister, told Muslim members of the CA, quote, not to pretend to say, oh, our affection is great for you. We have seen your affection. Let us forget that affection, end quote. Muslims would have to prove they were not disloyal or the disloyal other. Granted that these were words addressed specifically to Muslim members of the CA, but that the audience implied extended to the community at large became difficult to miss. The figure of the always potentially treasonous Muslim looking to enfeeble the state from within, was the foil, explicit or implicit, around which India's founding persons built the new state and its norms of governance. On 20th August 1949, B.R. Ambedkar introduced for discussion an amended version of Article 280 of the draft constitution dealing with state emergencies. The debate was over the suspension of certain fundamental rights during an emergency. At issue were civil liberties that Articles 13, 15, and 25 of the draft constitution protected. These referred to the rights to freedom of speech, protection of life and personal liberty, and the right to seek constitutional remedy, respectively. In defending Ambedkar's proposed emergency protocol, A.K. Iyer articulated what Giorgio Agamben would later theorize in a different context as the state of exception. Iyer reminded the House of a famous saying, though I have no idea who said this, that, quote, a war cannot be fought on principles of the Magna Carta. On this premise, he argued that the various freedoms and rights of citizens would have to be secured in terms of peace, but only so long as the insecurity of the state, as the security of the state is guaranteed and its continued existence assured. Otherwise, Iyer stated categorically, all these rights cannot exist. According to Iyer, in framing emergency regulations, quote, we are envisaging a situation threatened by war in a country with multitudinous people with possibly divided loyalties, though technically they may be citizens of India, end quote. The threat of war may retreat in some distant future, but until then, the constitution makers could not, Iyer said, proceed on the footing that in regard to all citizens of this country, their loyalty is assured, unquote. It does not require particularly fine skills of perception to detect Patel's perfidious Muslim lurking in the picture. And considering that the actual war with Pakistan had just ended a few months ago, obviously its threat was to be treated as though never ending. It's a pity no one even entertained H.V. Kamath's salient question about whether any emergency provisions were necessary at all in the independent Republic of India. After all, as he pointed out, despite all manner of ongoing trouble, quote, the central government has lived and is getting on very well without proclaiming a state of emergency, unquote. H.V. Kamath and Pandit Thakurdas Bhargav had also sounded a salutary note of caution when they pointed out that the meaning of the term emergency in Ambedkar's amendment was dangerously imprecise, depending entirely on the executive's subjective interpretation. This was an important point since that issue was a vital attribute of sovereign power. Who had the right to identify and to declare an emergency, or if you wish, a state of exception? R.K. Sidhwa joined in by expressing diametrically opposing views. Agreeing that emergency was a very flexible word, he insisted nevertheless with enviable certitude that, quote, it cannot be denied that an emergency is an emergency, unquote. Elaborating on his understanding of the particular emergency that threatened India even at the time, he said, quote, there are people outside who are enemies of the country. In this country and also outside, mischief mongers who are out to create mischief, unquote. It was against them that he wished to protect India's freedom, and for that he was, quote, prepared to sacrifice a little of his own freedom, unquote. The point is that he would not have to. In this draft, unlike the earlier version, Ambedkar had allowed that emergency provisions would not apply to the entire country if the crisis affected only a part or parts of it. For over a quarter of a century now, since a popularly backed insurgency began in Kashmir in 1989-1990, the state, but really only the Valley of Kashmir, has been designated a disturbed area according to very broad and vague criteria. Bhargav and Kamath had been prescient in their misgivings. This declaration of disturbance has meant the application of acutely restrictive laws such as the Armed Forces Special Powers Act of 1990 and the new teeth given to the older Public Safety Act. But other parts of the country have been sheltered from directly experiencing their repercussions. Out of this, it has been possible to build a consensus that such laws, however reprehensible in ordinary circumstances, are the necessary bitter pills someone has to swallow to defeat the emergency threatening the Indian state, both from the now disloyal Kashmiri Muslim and from Pakistan. Had all Indians been made to feel those laws, and for as long, it is unlikely they would have survived unchallenged. It's only the Kashmiris who have to, quote, sacrifice a little of their own freedom, not the RK Siddhas of India. To return to the CA and 1949, the debate had come full circle, with severe emergency powers for the executive being justified on the grounds of the inassimilable Muslim. On 27th May 1949, the Assembly began its first extensive discussions relating to J&K. Disagreement broke out immediately over how the state's 4 representatives to the CA would be chosen. Gopal Swami Iyengar, in moving his proposal, acknowledged that until then, where legislatures had existed in princely states, they had elected 50% of the representatives to the CA and the ruler nominated the rest. However, he argued in Kashmir's case, the Praja Sabha, its legislative assembly, was dead, having last been elected in the winter of 1946-47 and meeting only once before the war with Pakistan intervened. In the circumstances, Iyengar proposed that Sheikh Abdullah, the state's prime minister and also the leader of the most popular party, the National Conference, be allowed to, quote unquote, advise the Maharaja on whom to nominate as representatives. So essentially saying that Sheikh Abdullah would get to choose the 4 spokespeople for Kashmir. This proposal was immediately challenged by K.T. Shah, and in terms that already portended the religious molding of debates about J&K and its people. He argued that no matter how moribund the Praja Parishad still existed, it should therefore be allowed the right to elect all 4 of the state's representatives. What is more problematical is Shah's imbrication of religious and regional identities in order to question Sheikh Abdullah's qualification to nominate the state's representatives. Against Iyengar's contention that Abdullah's government, quote, represented the majority of the Kashmir population, unquote, Shah reminded the House that, quote, the population of Jammu and Kashmir put together is something like 76% Muslims and 24% Hindus, including Dogras and other non-Muslims, unquote. In the course of challenging Iyengar's proposal, Shah also raised the bogey of the suspect Muslim. He asked members of the CA to remember, quote, besides the composition of the people of Kashmir, its geographical position, its connection, and the possibilities of what may happen there, unquote. These were dark hints to piece together in their minds the disparate facts of Kashmiris being Muslims, Kashmir's territorial contiguity with Pakistan, and Muslim loyalty to Pakistan, to then contemplate the explosive result of this combination. In this context, Shah's solicitude was reserved specifically for the people of Jammu. He had suggested that the name for the state, as it appeared in Iyengar's motion, the state of Kashmir, be altered to describe it more correctly as the state of Jammu and Kashmir. Shah insisted that this proposed amendment carried more significance than, quote, a mere verbal emendation, unquote. Others had objected to Iyengar's name for the state too. Lakshmikanta Moitra had sought assurance that representatives would be sent from Jammu and Ladakh too, and H.V. Kamath added concern for Mirpur and Poonch. But Shah, unlike these two, in challenging a Kashmir-centric approach, was concerned solely with Jammu's inclusion, not the proper representation of of all parts of the former princely state. He insisted that in naming the state, Iyengar should not omit the other part, which he pointed out was also, quote, the first part of the title of that ancient state, end quote. Leaving aside the questionable antiquity he attributed to the state, the greater political importance of Jammu he was arguing for is evident. In the end, it took Jawaharlal Nehru's railroading to settle the issue along his preferred line, which were those advanced by Iyengar. Not incorrectly, Nehru dismissed the Praja Sabha as a bogus body. The elections to it had been held in fantastic and farcical circumstances, and all decent people in Kashmir had boycotted them, he said. Nehru also made a small concession on the name of the state, urging Iyengar to insert a modification in brackets. The state would now be termed, and here comes a mouthful, the state of Kashmir, open brackets, otherwise known as the state of Jammu and Kashmir, close brackets. Although Jammu made it into the parentheses, Ladakh was still noticeably missing. But that's another story for another paper. There were political developments outside the halls of the Central Legislative Assembly that fill out the picture on the positions taken by Shah and Nehru regarding Jammu versus Kashmir. The spectre of plebiscite, in the words of Balraj Puri, was hanging over Jammu and Ladakh. That plebiscite had been promised to all the state's people, as we know, by Lord Mountbatten and confirmed by Nehru upon the Maharajas signing the instrument of accession to India on 26th October 1947. By the plebiscite, the people would be given the opportunity to either confirm or reject the accession. Fear that a statewide plebiscite would go in Pakistan's favor made people in Jammu and Ladakh, quote unquote, receptive to proposals for dividing the state and holding zonal plebiscites instead. Sheikh Abdullah opposed outright any division of the state, and this explains partly the paranoia in Jammu against Sheikh Abdullah. Nehru was aware of these moves, especially by Hindu right-wing groups in Jammu, and the Maharaja's involvement in them. In a letter to Patel dated 17th April 1949, he spoke of their demand for a zonal plebiscite. He reminded Patel that the Maharaja had made a similar proposal a few months earlier. The movement was spearheaded by the Jammu Praja Parishad, a political party founded in November 1947 by the RSS activist Balraj Madho. The party represented overwhelmingly the interests of Hindu landlords and former officials of the Dogra state. An intelligence report indicated to Nehru that the agitation and propaganda were financed by the Maharaja, who was dipping liberally into the funds of the Dharmarth Trust, a religious endowment controlled by the Dogra rulers. In the end, as Nehru was confident that Jammu province was not, quote unquote, running away from India, he reminded Patel that, quote, the prize we are fighting for is the Valley of Kashmir, unquote. Fear among Muslims in both Kashmir and Jammu had already been roused by the Maharaja, his state troops, and the RSS's role in the massacre of close to 80,000 of their numbers in Jammu in the last months of 1947. Refugee accounts and those of English eyewitnesses, evidence the Maharaja's collusion in, even instigation of the pogrom. Hari Singh was seen with truckloads of arms. He fired the first shot at the Jammu refugee camp on the day of Eid and gave orders to kill elsewhere, distributed arms to the RSS, and even watched the slaughter of Muslims from his car at Narayana, all in Jammu province. It is unlikely Shah was speaking directly in support of the Maharajas or the RSS's course of action, but it is equally improbable that he was unaware of these goings on, that he asked the assembly to bear in mind the quarter Hindu proportion of the state's population, mentioning specifically the Dogras, who are from Jammu, assumes a particular significance in this broader context. Even if he was making a plea for Jammu's regional interest being protected against a domineering Kashmir by resorting to the religious idiom, he made Kashmir Muslim and Jammu Hindu. Contrary to received wisdom, Nehru was not past doffing his own cap to religion when it suited. For the secularists in the Congress, Nehru among them, was possession of Kashmir was vital to fulfilling India's national self-definition along lines no less tied to religious identity. As late as in 1953, Nehru proclaimed, quote, Kashmir is symbolic as it illustrates that we are a secular state, that Kashmir, with a large majority of Muslims, has nevertheless, of its own free will, wished to be associated with India, end quote. Paradoxically, then, emphasizing the Muslimness of Kashmir became instrumental to burnishing India's secularity. Accordingly, Nehru was concerned with the agitations in Jammu involving the Praja Parishad, the RSS, the Hindu Sabha, and later joined by the Bharatiya Jansangh. More particularly, he was concerned with the effect on Kashmir's Muslim majority, poised delicately as it was in its choice of India or Pakistan in a future plebiscite. Implicitly, then, ranged against the Hindu commonwealth in Nehru's mind were Muslims in Kashmir. And the only thing to prevent their choosing Pakistan was Indian secularism, not any Kashmiri secularism. So for Nehru, Kashmiri Muslims were not secular, or their secular was not strong enough for them to opt decisively for India. What is remarkable is that the religious lens through which the people of the state of Jammu and Kashmir came to be understood was the result not just of the politics of avowedly religious nationalists, but also of the words and deeds of self-professed secularists such as K.T. Shah and Nehru. Indeed, K.T. Shah was no Hindu bigot. On the contrary, he is associated with two attempts, both failed, to have the word secular introduced in the Constitution's preamble. However, neither his nor Nehru's arguments in the context of Kashmir could escape the religious frame within which the region was discussed even before the inauguration of the Indian Republic. Indeed, they may have helped create or at least reinforce that frame. Thank you.
Thank you, and that was quick. I'm going to be speaking about constitutional issues and the treatment of Pakistan's religious minorities today. But before I start, while there are a lot of historians and academics in this room, I have written an academic book, I would say, but I am someone who's also worked on these issues on the ground, I would say, in Pakistan, both in parliament and at the sites of religious pogroms and church burnings, etc. So when I speak of things, I'll speak in a slightly less academic language, maybe, because I like to get what I have to say across to a larger audience. So my paper, though, will be a little more academic. Thank you so much. Today, as we all know, the mistreatment or marginalization of ethnic and religious minorities has become a global phenomenon. Demagogues are generating hatred for the other in the United States, Europe, and indeed all over the world. Attacking minorities is for some a way to garner support of a strong faction within the majority. And exactly what we're seeing today, highlighted in a much bigger screen perhaps, are the sort of historical facts and underpinnings that we are all going to talk about. Only last month, Pakistan's capital Islamabad was the scene of violent protests against religious tolerance. A group of clerics blocked a key highway into the capital for 20 days, 3 weeks, before the government dared to take any action. When it did, Pakistan's army intervened and forced the government to concede to the Islamist protesters' demands. Now, how did Pakistan get here? And that's what I'm going to take you through, hopefully very quickly and not too boringly, through the different amendments to the Constitution, how they came around, and how each government in one way or the other, acceded to the extremists or the Islamists, as I call them. So Pakistan's constitution declares it an Islamic republic. The interpretation of what an Islamic republic means has varied at different times during the 70 years that Pakistan has existed as an independent state. Unfortunately, it has been consistent in its failure to fulfill Pakistan's obligations towards its minorities under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. When Pakistan was created on August 14, 1947, its territory was to include 23% non-Muslims among its population, almost a quarter. The bulk of that non-Muslim population in erstwhile East Pakistan, which became Bangladesh in 1971, but even the areas currently constituting Pakistan, including a large number of Hindus, Sikhs, Zoroastrians, Christians, and Buddhists. The proportion of non-Muslims in Pakistan's population has since fallen to approximately 3%, 23% to 3%. When you think of democracy and pluralism, the less pluralism you have, the weaker the underpinnings of a free and democratic state will be. Furthermore, the distinction among Muslim denominations has become far more accentuated over the years. Muslim groups such as the Shias, who account for approximately 20 or 25% of Pakistan's Muslim population, are often targeted by violent extremists. Ahmadis, barely 1% of the Muslim population, have been declared non-Muslim by the writ of the state. Non-Muslim minorities such as Christians, Hindus, and Sikhs have been the victims of suicide bomb attacks on their neighborhoods, and their community members have been converted to Islam against their will. Houses of worship of non-Muslims as well as of Muslim minority sects have been attacked and bombed while filled with worshippers. Right before Christmas in Quetta in Balochistan, thank you, Ambassador Mailam. In Quetta in Balochistan, just before Christmas, a Methodist church in Quetta in Balochistan was filled with worshippers and was attacked violently. The church was filled with women and children. Pakistan has descended to its current state of religious intolerance through a series of political decisions made by its leaders after the death of its founder, Muhammad Ali Jinnah. The descent began in 1949 with the Constituent Assembly declaring the objective of Pakistan's constitution to be the creation of an Islamic state. It reached a nadir with the Islamization drive under General Zia during the 1980s. Today, the country is dealing with armed militias and terrorist groups, many of which were sponsored by the state under the Zia regime and in the civil and military governments since, so all are culpable, each intent on imposing its version of Islam by violent means. With their public statements and political machinations, Pakistani early leaders steered the country away from Mr. Jinnah's secular vision. In March 1949, early days, Prime Minister Liaquat Ali Khan moved in the Constituent Assembly what came to be known as the Objectives Resolution, a declaration of the goals of the new state that would form the basis of its future constitution and laws. The resolution described a vision for Pakistan diametrically opposed to the secular one Jinnah had offered in his August 11, 1947 speech. The net effect of the Objectives Resolution was to define the state in Islamic terms, opening the door for further legislation based on the interpretation of Islam by a parliamentary majority. By 1953, the resentment against Hindus was supplanted by antagonism towards the Ahmadiyya sect, also referred to pejoratively as Qadianis or Mirzais. The demands of the anti-Ahmadi agitators were unusual for a modern democratic state. Not only was the state being asked to decide who was or was not part of a specific religion, it was being called upon to officially discriminate against members of a religious sect. The problem with conceding these demands were manifold. At the most fundamental level, it would set the dangerous precedent of involving the state in determining which sects were acceptably Muslim. Now, the state is not only deciding, freedom of religion and bigger things that you think of, but who is a Muslim? So here we, are already going down the slippery slope. Once the Ahmadis were officially declared non-Muslim in 1974, the first country in the world to do so, a new campaign started with the intent to subject the Shias to similar prescriptions. With the anti-Ahmadiyya protests, Pakistan had moved from purging non-Muslims to an extended period of bitter fighting over who may be deemed Muslim and how to make the state more Islamic. That debate continues to the present day with grave consequences for religious minorities. In 1956, when the Second Constituent Assembly was finally able to arrive at some sort of consensus, it named Pakistan the Islamic Republic of Pakistan and included the Objectives Resolution as the preamble to the Constitution. Part 3 of that Constitution laid down several directive principles of state policy. These included Islamic provisions such as steps shall be taken to enable the Muslims of Pakistan individually and collectively to order their lives in accordance with the Holy Quran and Sunnah, and to promote unity and the observance of Islamic moral standards. The 1956 Pakistan Constitution barred non-Muslims from holding the office of head of state. After imposing martial law, Pakistan's first military ruler, General Ayub Khan, arbitrarily framed a new constitution for Pakistan in 1962. His only secular gesture was to initially refer to the country as the Republic of Pakistan, though later he reverted to the title of Islamic Republic of Pakistan. Like the 1956 Constitution, the new Basic Law also included several Islamic provisions and restricted the office of president to Muslims. A council of Islamic ideology was assigned the task of recommending to the government how to bring all laws in conformity with the Quran and Sunnah. So on one hand, you have this elected parliamentary democracy that you're going to see coming forth in Pakistan, but you have this Council of Islamic Ideology of clerics whose job it is to look at all these laws and see do they conform with the Quran and Sunnah. So it's the beginnings are unsound, I would say. The loss of East Pakistan in 1971 drastically reduced the number and influence of religious minorities in the country. But the reduction in territory and population did not end the drive for Islamization. On the contrary, Pakistan's leaders persisted in nation building through religion rather than embracing inclusive civic nationalism. Pakistan's religious minorities were now more beleaguered than ever. The 73 Constitution not only retained the Islamic provisions from earlier versions, but also added new ones. Islam was declared the state religion of Pakistan, and a promise was made to ensure that all existing laws conform with the injunctions of Islam as laid down in the Holy Quran and Sunnah. The Constitution declared that no law shall be enacted which is repugnant to such injunctions. But it also promised that adequate provision should be made for the minorities freely to profess and practice their religions and develop their cultures. In addition to appealing to the Islamists with constitutional provisions, the civilian government led by Zulfikar Ali Bhutto also created a ministry for religious and minorities affairs, which was to undertake programs appealing to the religious sentiments of the population. The Ahmadi controversy also resurfaced, and in September 1974, under the government of the PPP and Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, both houses of Pakistan's parliament passed the Second Amendment to Pakistan's constitution, pronouncing Ahmadis non-Muslim. So now the deed was done. The Second Amendment of the Pakistani Constitution altered Article 106, Clause 3, which lists religious minority communities to include persons of Qadiani group or the Lahori group who call themselves Ahmadis. The Ahmadis were the only religious minority who were listed in the Constitution, not by the name they use, but by pejoratives applied to them by their detractors. It was akin to a predominantly Protestant Christian country describing Catholics as papists in its fundamental laws. Moreover, a new clause that attempted to define Muslim was added to Article 260 of the Constitution, transforming a purely religious question into a matter of law. But the constitutional amendment created a religious dilemma for the Ahmadis and effectively took away their freedom of religion. Their faith required them to insist that they were Muslims, albeit with some beliefs that departed from those of other Islamic denominations. The law, however, would now deem them non-Muslims. The government made things even more complicated by requiring all applicants for passports, and I had to do this at a young age, passports and mandatory national identity cards to sign a declaration if they wanted to be identified as Muslims. The language of the declaration made it impossible for Ahmadis to get a passport or national identity card as a Muslim without denouncing their denomination's founder as an impostor. So, for example, my colleague and friend Raza Rumi and myself, in the past, when we applied for Pakistani passports, we had to write that we call the Ahmadi community and their prophet an imposter, used derogatory language for them, and we had to sign those forms to get a Pakistani passport. So what they did by doing this was made all Pakistanis complicit in the upholding of this law. For the first time, 30 years after independence, Pakistanis at least debated the role of Islam in matters of state, even as the political balance gradually shifted against secular and pluralist ideas. Once General Muhammad Zia-ul-Haq seized power through a military coup in 1977, debate was terminated and replaced by arbitrary and forced Islamization. Zia changed laws by decree, imposed draconian punishments based on medieval interpretations of Islam, silenced secular critics, and changed school curricula to pass on his bigoted worldview to the next generation. From the first few weeks of his martial law regime, Zia imposed laws which he described as reforms, designed to create a Nizam-e-Islam, Islamic system of government in Pakistan. His lack of tolerance for other faiths was particularly evident in his general disregard for the concern of Pakistan's minorities. Non-Muslim standings as citizens was reduced before the courts, and the power of their franchise was also diluted by shrewd alterations to the electoral laws. Although Zia did not hold legislative elections until 1985, he changed the representation of the People's Act of 1976 to reintroduce separate communal electorates. Non-Muslim minorities could no longer vote along with Muslims to elect officials to local councils or provincial and federal legislatures. A fixed number of non-Muslim seats were to be allocated in each elected body, and non-Muslims could vote for members only of their own religious community. This measure diminished the political influence of non-Muslims, as their representatives in elected bodies did not carry any weight within their political parties. Using his sweeping powers under martial law, Zia issued a presidential ordinance in 1984 that barred Ahmadis from performing azan, the call to prayer, and from describing their places of worship as a mosque or masjid. Zia's ordinance went further than the 74 constitutional amendment in defining the terms Muslim and non-Muslim. The new provisions of the Penal Code 298C forbade Ahmadis from posing as Muslims, which meant they could not publicly practice or profess their faith as they considered themselves Muslim. An Orthodox Muslim could go to the police and simply complain that an Ahmadi had outraged his religious feelings, and the Ahmadi in question could be arrested. Under Zia's rule, Pakistan's legal system was methodically stacked against religious minorities, and legislation was passed that gravely impinged upon their right to maintain or openly profess their beliefs. Furthermore, the Pakistan Penal Code and the Criminal Procedure Code were amended under Zia's rule through ordinances in 1980, 1982, and 1986. These criminalize any act that could cause dishonor to the Holy Prophet, the family of the Prophet, the companions of the Prophet, and any Sharia Islamic symbols. A simple complaint to the police about any action that may constitute a crime under the dubiously wide-ranging provisions of these ordinances could result in an arrest and trial, leading to punishments of imprisonments or a fine or both. These legal changes enable bigoted Muslims to persecute, settle scores, or otherwise seek advantages against religious minorities by bringing false cases under the vaguely worded blasphemy law. The march towards Islamization was not slowed, unfortunately, by Zia's death and the return to civilian rule. One of the many legacies of Zia al-Haq that found special resonance in this period related to the blasphemy laws. In October 1990, the federal Sharia court had determined that the penalty for contempt of the Holy Prophet is death and nothing else. So if you remember any cartoon controversies and things like that, you can understand that in Pakistan, it was made law. So this vigilante culture that we see increasingly in Pakistan now for people to take the law in their own hands is because they were given permission by the laws of the land, in a way. Once it became known that the death penalty was the only punishment in cases including blasphemy or insult to Islam's prophet, the floodgates opened for the abuse of the relevant provisions, and rampant abuse of these laws was by no means restricted to the authorities, though the police as well as political and sectarian organizations were most often involved. In Pakistan, bail is restricted in cases involving the death penalty. A person accused under Section 295C would therefore face immediate imprisonment before the case was heard in court. The blasphemy statute thus became a convenient tool for retribution or to gain an advantage against anyone with whom one might have a dispute, regardless of the nature of the dispute. Soon there were instances of blasphemy complaints being lodged to force the hands of business rivals or even to exact revenge against someone who had spurned an unwanted sexual advance. Pakistan's fourth military ruler, General Pervez Musharraf, described his policies as enlightened moderation, and there was a great deal of excitement in Washington and many other world capitals when Musharraf took over, and people said, oh yes, enlightened moderation, and this man is the boss and he's going to change things in Pakistan. So he often announced reforms that were diluted after initial publicity. For example, he announced his intention to change the procedure for initiating criminal proceedings under blasphemy laws, making it difficult to file false charges. The announcement fell far short of ending blasphemy laws, but was nonetheless welcomed by minorities as an improvement. However, Musharraf failed to introduce the promised changes after protests from Islamic mobs. Similarly, he ended the separate electorates, allowing non-Muslims to vote and run for office alongside Muslims in general elections. Some seats in parliament and provincial legislatures were still reserved for non-Muslims, and for that purpose, a non-Muslim voter register was created. Ahmadis still could not vote because they refused to put their names in the non-Muslim register of voters, insisting that they were Muslims. So to this day, the Ahmadis do not vote because they refuse to agree to being in a non-Muslim category. Notwithstanding what Pakistan's law declared them to be. Musharraf initially also expressed sympathy for Christians and Hindus and promised the end of religious militancy, but overall the situation did not improve for Pakistan's minorities during his decade in power. Pakistani laws, especially ones that deal with blasphemy, deny or interfere with the practice of minority faiths. Religious minorities are targets of legal as well as social discrimination. Most significantly, in recent years, Pakistan has witnessed some of the worst organized violence against religious minorities since partition. Over an 18-month period covering 2012 and part of 2013, at least 200 incidents of sectarian violence were reported. These incidents led to some 1,800 casualties, including more than 700 deaths. Now, I've just given you a teeny snapshot of time. Many of those targeted for violence during this period were Shia Muslim citizens who are deemed part of Pakistan's Muslim majority under its constitutional laws. During the same year-and-a-half period in 2012 to 13, Shias were subject to 77 attacks, including suicide terrorist bombings during Shia religious observances. However, 54 lethal attacks were also perpetrated against Ahmadis, 37 against Christians, 16 against Hindus, and 3 against Sikhs. Attackers of religious minorities are seldom prosecuted, and if they are, the courts almost invariably set them free. Members of the majority community, the Sunnis, who dared to question state policies about religious exclusion, like my friend Raza Rumi, are just as vulnerable to extremist violence. Thank you very much. I just tried to lay out as simply as possible a lot of laws and regulations. Thank you.
Before we move to the next speaker, I've been asked to tell those of you in this room that the wireless password is capital W, capital C, lowercase MAY 005, and please feel free to live tweet from this event using the hashtag Religious Freedom in South Asia. It's a mouthful. All right, our next speaker is Professor Dina Siddiqui. Thank you.
Thank you, Niti. And thank you for organizing this. Thank you, Michael. And thanks, Joshua Spooner, wherever he is, for helping bring me here. I am an anthropologist, not a historian. I won't deal with dates. I will go back and forth in time in my presentation. And I want to talk about minorities, not just, I know this conference is about religious freedom, but I want to talk about the making of minorities and ethnic and religious minorities inside Bangladesh. And I hope perhaps I will be a little provocative. We'll see. So, the 15th Amendment to the Bangladesh Constitution, approved by Parliament on June 30th, 2011, was widely heralded as a landmark moment in the nation's political trajectory. While the government's primary objective was to dismantle the non-party caretaker system of government, the ruling Awami League also took this opportunity to keep an election pledge and undo the damage wrought by 15 years of militarized rule. To much fanfare, the amendment restored secularism as a fundamental governing principle, as had been laid out in the preamble to the original 1972 Constitution. And along with secularism, you had socialism as well as nationalism and democracy as principles. Notably, Parliament maintained a scrupulous silence on another highly controversial earlier amendment, one that had enshrined Islam as the state religion. Effectively, then, Bangladesh became a constitutionally secular country with an officially recognized state religion. Since then, public debates have raged over the legal and symbolic anomalies of this situation, which I'm not going to go into. Less remarked upon for potential contradictions in relation to minority rights was another provision in the 15th Amendment, one that proclaimed that, quote, the people of Bangladesh shall be known as Bangalis as a nation, unquote, and that the citizens of Bangladesh shall be known as Bangladeshi. In effect, the article institutionalized a distinct division between a core Bengali people who formed the nation and its not Bengali citizens, creating two classes of belonging and claims to nationhood. This tension between national belonging and citizenship has a much longer history, as we will see. Curiously, the overt reinscription of Bengali cultural majoritarianism through the 15th Amendment generated muted response on the whole, other than from Adivashi leaders, indigenous leaders, and rights activists. In order to make sense, locate and make sense of these developments, it is necessary to turn to the past, to the ghosts that haunt the political and cultural landscape of Bangladesh, with the aim of unpacking and unsettling narratives otherwise taken for granted. To this end, I want to begin with some thoughts on secularism as theory and the historically inflected meanings of the secular in Bangladeshi nationalist discourse. Conventional accounts cast Bangladesh as a once tolerant nation where the increasing presence of political Islam has steadily eroded the secular state, thereby endangering minority rights in particular and women's and political rights in general. This nostalgic erosion narrative is problematic, not least because it assumes an original state of secular purity from which there has been a fall, and to which to aspire again, and I want to argue that the original was somewhat problematic. It is also profoundly depoliticizing in that Islam, or a certain version of it, becomes the singular culprit, one to be rooted out. And therefore, no politics, whether it's geopolitics or local national politics, it doesn't, one need not concern oneself with that. The precarious state of minorities in Bangladesh, I contend, is not a symptom of an incomplete or failed secularism, but a feature of the violence of nation-state making processes, especially under conditions of globalization. And here I'm drawing on people like the anthropologist Arjun Appadurai, who've written very much on violence and the making of minorities. That's very appropriate. He wrote it a long time ago in relation to the rise of the BJP and the incredible pogroms in Gujarat, anti-Muslim pogroms in Gujarat, but they've become very, unfortunately, they've become quite relevant again today. This is a point to which I'll return at the end of my paper. Now, my argument isn't against secularism per se, but only to point out its limitations and also a plea for reframing the minority question. Any automatic association of constitutionally sanctioned secularism with the protection of minority rights does not withstand either theoretical or empirical scrutiny. In the first place, categorical boundaries between what we consider to be secular and religious are fluid, unstable, and co-constitutive. They are always decided by the state. They always have been. They are not a priori categories. They're decided through courts, through various kinds of mutually entangled discourses. Second, as numerous post-colonial scholars have demonstrated, secular states invariably rely on the norms of a majoritarian culture, and in the case that I'm talking about, on a Bengali majoritarian culture, to make legal determinations on what constitutes the religious as opposed to the cultural or the secular, and therefore what rights are to be protected and which minorities' rights are worthy of protection. If instead we approach secularism as a project of governmentality, of the production and management of religious majorities and minorities, we see in Bangladesh, for instance, that among other things, it excludes those who are defined outside a religious minority grid. This is evident today with the 15th Amendment, that both restores secularism, maintains Islam as a national state, but also defines certain minority groups, the indigenous groups, groups in the Chittagong Hill Tracts, Urdu speakers, what have you, as outside the cultural nation. This raises a whole set of issues around the construction of minority as identity and who counts as a minority. Clearly, not all minorities are equal, and who is a minority worthy of protection changes inside Bangladesh, or the area region that is now Bangladesh. In the time left to me, I'm trying to time this, but I have a long paper, I'd like to reflect on the nature and prehistory of the apparent contradictions pushed to the surface by the 15th Amendment. These inconsistencies can be traced to historically specific conceptions of the imagining of secularism in relation to the making of a Bengali community in the territory that becomes Bangladesh. I'll try and spell this out. I'm arguing that Bengali intellectuals, especially the architects of the Constitution, had a taken for granted understanding of secularism as leaving Islam out of state matters. It wasn't about minority rights at all. And that was essential to their personal and national ontology, national self-making. Forged in the shadow of the idea of Pakistan, the resulting centrality of secularism in the making of a national community sets Bangladesh apart, I would argue, from both India and Pakistan. And I think, as Mridu Rai's paper brings out, at the core of Indian nationalism was a cultural identity that you could think of as Hindu. At the core of Pakistan was this idea of what does it mean to be a Muslim state. I think in Bangladesh it was what does it mean to be Bangladeshi, Bengali. And it was about a certain kind of secularism, what in Bengali is called ashampradayikata, or non-communalism. And I argue this was an aspiration to Bengali ethnic and linguistic nationhood that had to transcend or could not admit to religious difference among Bengalis, because the Bengali nation had to be imagined as not Pakistan, but also not West Bengal, where there were also Bengali speakers. And this was an unspoken question that was grappled with. What does it mean for Bangladesh to be not Pakistan and not West Bengal? And in the course of asking this question, the imagining of the Bengali nation, and this was not meant as anything, I think, negative, non-Bengali speakers, whether they were Muslim or otherwise, were an afterthought structurally outside the nation, right? To understand the place of Islam in the nationalist imagination in Bangladesh, one has to return to the story of Pakistan and look more closely at how that story is told over time, and is told in different ways, of course. Let me briefly present my reading of the Pakistan and Islam conundrum as it relates to present-day Bangladeshi politics. As we know, the Muslimness of Pakistan was not, at least initially, an overtly religious concept, as we've just heard. Among other things, the borders of Pakistan represented, the making of Pakistan, you could argue, represented a resolution of a demographic dilemma. It is not incidental that the Jamaat-e-Islami initially opposed the idea of Pakistan. Now, I'm not saying that Pakistan was a place insufficiently imagined. I don't subscribe to that at all. I'm only saying that the idea of Pakistan meant very different things to different constituencies, and the multiple meanings of Pakistan, especially in East Pakistan, could not be reduced to some ahistorical vision of a desire for an Islamic state. In fact, the desire for an Islamic state was not part of the discourse of colonization at all, and at that time there were no Islamic nations anywhere in the world. Things changed rapidly during the Cold War years, as charted powerfully by Sadia Tur in her book, The State of Islam. U.S. imperial interests in stamping out nascent communist movements in the decolonized world converged with local power struggles inside Pakistan to give religion a much more prominent place in the articulation of nationhood and state policy. This was also the same period, the 1950s, that saw the emergence of the Bengali regional autonomy movement, including the Bhasha Andolon, the language movement. And if you look at the material, this movement was not about opposing Islam, but about opposing a certain vision of Pakistan, which is a critical line that gets blurred over time and in moments of crisis. Bangladesh was envisioned before 1971 as not Pakistan, as a secular space in which which was not going to be organized administratively or legally on the basis of religion. But the point is that the shifting nature and basic ambiguity, or I suppose openness in the meaning of Pakistan, was generative of a host of problems around the relationship between religion and national community in Bangladesh. Here, it's important to remember that most of the intellectuals and politicians at the vanguard of the Bengali language movement were implicitly or explicitly supportive of the Pakistan movement. Not very popular to say. I know this is being live streamed, so maybe I should just stop here. But not on the basis of piety, but a set of idealistic aspirations. Of course, the events if the 1950s and 60s in Pakistani politics left them tremendously disenchanted, and of course, and that is the beginning of the idea of Bangladesh. So it's evident that between 1947 and 1971, the relationship between nation, community, and religion shifted in deeply contested ways in the larger political discourse. In independent Bangladesh, the tendency to associate Pakistan with radical right-wing Islam happened gradually, and we see it, it happens much more after 1975. It's important to remember that the emergence of state-sponsored Islamization and military dictatorship happen together in Bangladesh, just like they happened in Pakistan, but they happen in the waning years of the Cold War and with the rise of a certain kind of neoliberal ideology of the market, and they come together. So this is the time, post-75, when this ideology of the secular, as not Pakistan slides into the secular, as not Islam, and because the place of Islam has always been problematic in thinking through what Bangladesh means, I think the secular comes to acquire, as I say, an almost sacred appeal, a certain understanding of the secular that I think can be quite damaging. So what I probably won't have too much time to do is in the rest of the paper, I have some examples of how this relationship between Islam and Bengaliness changes after 1971. So, for example, Abul Hashem, the first president of the Language Action Committee, who is vilified today for his association with the Muslim League, at the time, didn't seem to feel any contradiction in being a Muslim and being a Bengali nationalist. It wasn't there. It's only ad hoc that becomes a problem. Sufia Kamal, the national poet, once apparently wrote a poem glorifying Jinnah. This I got on Facebook, but I've gotten the poem. But this has become a bone of contention because apparently the poem is no longer in official circulation. I have the poem, actually, but it has been relegated to the realm of the unspeakable, that which does not fit current nationalist narratives, and so which lives in the realm of the haunted, but which is always in danger of coming back. That's the whole idea of ghosts. Ghosts don't go away. They live in these intermediate zones. Right. Now, I have a lot more on the CA, the Constituent Assembly debates. I just want to flag a couple of things about it. These debates, of course, represent perhaps the foundational moment of national self-fashioning, at least at that point, right? The first thing that jumps out is the remarkably short time in which a final formal document was produced. A 34-member drafting committee chaired by the law minister, Dr. Kamal Hussain, was appointed in early April 1972. The Constitution was formally adopted on December 16th of that year, which marked the first anniversary of Victory Day. 3 readings of the draft document took place between October 12th and November 4th, after which it was finalized. So compared to, for instance, today in Nepal, this was an extraordinary feat, or, for anywhere else. So it was really tight. It was only basically in 1 month or less than 3 weeks that you had, any kind of discussion. Now, I don't know about this. I haven't talked to people about this, but this is I have talked to a couple of people. 2 issues seem to have driven the urgency and the rush to formalize the nation's credentials. They also underscore the fragility of the new nation. Bangladesh's emergence in the middle of Cold War and regional politics left it vulnerable in unanticipated ways in the global order of nations. It was not recognized initially by the US, which had actively supported West Pakistan during the war in a bid to renew relations with China, and which was suspicious of the socialist bent of the new government. Bangladesh was also dismissed by Arab nations, then rising in importance because of the oil economy, which saw the break from West Pakistan as a rupture in Muslim fraternity. Equally significant were real and imagined internal threats. The authority of the heavily Awami League-dominated 1972 Constituent Assembly came under attack from leftist intellectuals and political parties, as well as some right-wing. Basically, the new Constituent Assembly was deemed not legitimate because it had been, the people who were there had been elected before the war in 1971. So many people made a big fuss about that. So the Assembly debates are littered with references to external and internal conspiracies. Besieged from all directions, the Awami League government no doubt felt under tremendous pressure to seal the stamp of national being or legitimacy through formalizing the constitution. The fiery young communist leader and later Awami League stalwart, Suranjit Sen Gupta, repeatedly made pleas to have the draft constitution circulated to common citizens in order to establish what he calls the Jonomot or public opinion, but he was repeatedly rebuffed. So I've looking through the Constituent Assembly debates of those 3 weeks, what it shows is that there was almost no debate on religion and very little on minority rights, but they were on ethnic minority rights of the Chakmas and others. But it was really all about the nature of socialism and the redistribution of rights. Not all, most of it. Very interesting. I spoke to, as part of my research, I spoke to the person who translated the English draft into the Bangla constitution, and he said, Professor Anisuzzaman, he said, a non-communal approach was the central thrust of the Bangla Bhasha movement, but there's something you have to remember. This is very telling that he said that we didn't include secularism in the constitution because of gratitude to India, in the same way that we didn't include socialism in the constitution because of gratitude to the Soviet Union. It's a very interesting thing. And he says, well, India didn't even have secularism in the constitution, but clearly Bangladesh was, this is what I get, there's much more to be gotten out of that, what he said, but clearly he was responding to post hoc criticisms of the Awami League government as a client state from various people. Now, I'm going to end, there's been a lot, I think, about minorities, especially Hindu minorities, and the numbers going down of Hindu minorities in Bangladesh. I have 1 minute in which I want to say just a couple of things. I want to end with some thoughts on violence, belonging, and the exclusionary nature of all nationalisms. Professor Anisuzzaman traces the emergence of anti-Hindu violence in Bangladesh to 1990, when the false news of the destruction of the Babri Masjid in India provoked retaliatory violence against Hindus. Since then, he says, communal violence, first against Hindus, then against Buddhists, has expanded. I think we should go back much further to the foundational violence of the 1947 partition and the legal infrastructure that accompanied it. The East Pakistani Emergency Requisition of Property Act of 1948, the East Bengal Evacuees Act of 1951, ensured that Hindus living in East Pakistan were perpetually in danger of having their land requisitioned as evacuee property. Kind of as a mirror of what was happening in India, the specter of the Hindu as outsider, as not sufficiently Pakistani, was resurrected regularly in East Pakistan, right? As West Pakistan sought off to fight off an imminent insurgency. There is that. But in independent Bangladesh, the transformation of this law into the Vested Property Act also ended up making first which first targeted Urdu speakers in 1972, has made Hindus and other ethnic minorities vulnerable to dispossession. And this dispossession of land has been critical to, I think, the seeping away of the Hindu population. As the sociologist Shelley Feldman has mapped in very important ways, the dispossession of land and the making of Hindus as national others in contemporary Bangladesh go hand in hand. This is a very important thing. And I just want to end by saying we need to pay much more attention to the cultural forms through which othering and expropriation are legitimated. If in Bangladesh, impoverished Hindus, along with ethnic populations, are the ones whose rights can be compromised without fear of outrage, we see that this othering is symptomatic. It is not particular to Bangladesh. It is not about some pathological Islam. The case of Muslim Indians, and India has a secular constitution, India apparently has laws protecting its minorities, and the Rohingya in Burma, in which the Rohingya have been written out of the national imagination. These are excellent examples. I suggest we revisit the violence inherent in nation-state making processes and the affective appeal of secularism, which can easily become a cover or an alibi for a variety of state and non-state aggressions. Thank you.
Thank you, Nidhi, Michael, and all of the Wilson Center, also Bijan and the Royal Society for Asian Affairs for hosting this timely and important conference, and also for including Myanmar with South Asia. When Myanmar began its transition to semi-democratic rule in 2011, no one knew what was coming. From 2011 to 2016, a partially elected government led by retired military officers was in power. They lifted pre-publication censorship, they facilitated mobile phone and internet access, and initiated a nationwide peace process with more than a dozen ethnic armed groups. People were surprised. After decades of insisting on that federalism would destroy the country, the government began to consider whether some sort of federalism might be a possible solution. Through freer media and Facebook, people started to learn about some of the Myanmar military's abuses against ethnic minorities in ethnic conflict areas. There was more sympathy for ethnic minorities and their plight. But in terms of religious minorities, the situation was very different. Buddhist nationalist movements emerged and quickly gained momentum. That has continued under Aung San Suu Kyi's government, which came to power in 2016. Today, religious minorities in Myanmar, particularly Muslims, are in a precarious position, and neither the Constitution nor the state can be counted on for protection. In this presentation, I will first explain who the religious minorities are and how their identities overlap with other identities. Then I will talk about the enabling environment that has been created for religious nationalism, and I will conclude with some comments on the 2008 Constitution and the role of the judicial system in the current government. So Myanmar has a population of 51 million people, of whom almost 88% are Buddhist. Buddhist nationalists say that the Muslim population has been growing rapidly in the country. But in fact, if we look at the statistics from the census in 1973 and the 2014 census, we see that the Muslim population has barely increased in the past 40 years. It's just over 4% today, and in fact, the Christians can constitute a larger population, but still just a little over 6% of the population as a whole. Religious minorities and ethnic identities intersect in various ways. Some ethnic minorities are predominantly Christian, making them double minorities. Other ethnic minority groups, such as the Rakhine, are predominantly Buddhist. They are part of the religious majority. Muslims residing in central Myanmar typically identify as ethnic Burmans, but Burman nationalists do not accept this identification. They conflate Burman ethnic identity with adherence to Buddhism. In 1982, the military government introduced a restrictive citizenship law, and only members of indigenous races could obtain full citizenship. Those whose ancestors had immigrated during the colonial period were relegated to associate or nationalized citizenship, which conferred less rights. Thus, the descendants of South Asians and Chinese in the country were affected by this. Now we come to the Rohingya. The Rohingya population today descends from ancestors who lived in the pre-colonial Rakhine Kingdom, which had a mix of Muslim and Buddhist populations, as well as ancestors who came from what is now Bangladesh into what is now Myanmar during the colonial and post-colonial period. After the 1982 citizenship law came into effect, the Myanmar government did not recognize the Rohingya as an indigenous race. Yet in the parliamentary period, the Myanmar government did at times refer to the Rohingya as an indigenous race. For instance, in the early 1960s, there was a regular Rohingya language program on the state radio station, along with regular broadcasts by other ethnic minorities. In more recent years, though, many government officials and Rakhine Buddhists have sought to erase this history. They refer to the Rohingya as Bengali in order to frame this population as recent immigrants from Bangladesh with no legitimate claim to citizenship. Why are they so opposed to this particular population? Primarily because they comprise almost a third of the population in Rakhine State, at least before the recent expulsions. The fear is that they could become the dominant population in Rakhine State in the future. As a result, local authorities enacted measures to restrict the mobility of the Rohingya population, particularly in rural areas, which made it difficult for them to access education, hospitals, and also markets. And most were only granted temporary residence documents, even if they previously had had official documents that granted them more extensive rights. Meanwhile, Buddhist nationalists in other parts of the country have incited fears that Muslims could take over the entire country. They offer examples of other countries or other lands that were once Buddhist, which have now become predominantly Muslim. While Muslims in other parts of Myanmar typically have associate or full citizenship, they too have been framed as not belonging, both because of their religion and presumed foreign ancestry. Many, though not all Christians, also view the Rohingya and other Muslims as foreigners without justifiable claims to citizenship or land rights. While they too are worried about growing Buddhist nationalism, they feel entitled to better treatment because they are members of indigenous races. What then explains the rise of Buddhist nationalism? Successive military governments in Myanmar have framed non-Buddhists and foreigners as threats. At times, they diverted popular attention away from government failures by instigating anti-Muslim violence. But they made sure to contain Buddhist nationalism to prevent the emergence of a Buddhist anti-government movement. For instance, they imprisoned Wirathu, one of the best-known ultranationalist monks today, in 2003, and the charges were inciting anti-Muslim hatred. He was not released from prison for 8 years until after the transition began. With the transition in 2011, space opened up for civil society and social media. Buddhist nationalist organizations and networks were able to organize freely and to spread their messages easily. They quickly attracted large numbers into their orbit because they provided both religious and secular services. That is not to say that all Buddhists accept the more extremist rhetoric and incitements to violence of some ultranationalists, but those who do feel that their fears are justified, in part because of the anti-Muslim and anti-foreign sentiment that we see in other parts of the world today. State officials have also played an enabling role in strengthening Buddhist nationalism, and this has taken many forms. Between 2011 and 2016, there were linkages between certain state officials, members of the armed forces, the ruling military-backed party, and Buddhist nationalist groups. The chief ministers, who in the United States we would call governors, were told to build patron-client relations with Buddhist nationalist monks in their states and regions, and to provide assistance to them in their monasteries. Well-to-do businessmen with connections to the military-backed party and to the military also donated generously to such monks. And in the lead up to the 2015 election, the election officials did not stop members of the largest Buddhist nationalist movement from openly supporting the ruling party candidates, even though this appeared to violate election laws and the principles in the Constitution. In 2012, the military-backed government managed the outbreak of communal violence in Rakhine State by putting over 100,000 Rohingya Muslims in internally displaced camps and not allowing them to leave those camps for the rest of its period of government. Several thousand Buddhists were also temporarily displaced, but had freedom of movement, and most of them eventually were able to return to their homes. The military-backed government also passed what have been called the 4 Race and Religion Laws in 2015. The purpose of these laws was to limit conversion to Islam, to prevent marriages between Buddhist women and Muslim men, to block Muslim men from having more than one wife, and to limit the size of Muslim families. In sum, the military-backed government sought to portray itself as protecting Buddhism and implied that the National League for Democracy, or NLD, would not do the same. Since the NLD came to power in 2016, the civilian part of the government has tried to some degree to rein in Buddhist nationalism, but they've been afraid to go too far. For example, in 2017, the government-sponsored Monks Council banned the ultranationalist monk Wirthu from giving religious sermons for 1 year. But when he contravened that ban, the Ministry of Religious Affairs and Culture let it go. The National League for Democracy government's lack of firm stand against religious discrimination appears to have signaled to local authorities and Buddhist nationalists that they can continue to carry out their discriminatory actions. So, for example, today there are more than 20 Muslim-free villages in various parts of the country with the acquiescence of local authorities. Such signs, in some cases, are directed against all non-Buddhists, not just Muslims. And in 2015, an influential monk in Karen State ordered his followers to build a Buddhist pagoda in a Christian church compound, even though the church property was officially registered with the government. In other places with Buddhist community support, authorities have not allowed Muslims to repair or reopen mosques that were damaged after incidents of communal violence. In northern Rakhine State, the military responded to Rohingya militant attacks on Myanmar border posts in October 2016 and August 2017 by carrying out brutal counterinsurgency operations. These were similar to past counterinsurgency operations in ethnic minority conflict areas, but affected far greater numbers of people. Hundreds of Rohingya villages were razed, and according to Doctors Without Borders, more than 6,700 Rohingya were killed in the security operations, out of whom at least 730 were children under 5. The operation was labeled a textbook case of ethnic cleansing by the United Nations, and in total, over 800,000 Rohingya have fled to Bangladesh in the last year and a half. So the military leadership has claimed that no abuses were committed by its troops, and the reports from their own official investigations into these abuses have also asserted that there were no abuses. Aung San Suu Kyi and other NLD government officials, the state media, and some state officials' Facebook accounts have also repeated these claims. They've castigated the foreign media and human rights organizations for what they claim are false accounts of military abuses. They have sought to focus attention instead on the abuses by the Rohingya militant group. But they have not allowed independent investigators or journalists into this area to investigate for themselves. Why has the NLD government defended the military? It's likely largely due to political expediency, as well as the fact that many in the NLD share the same prejudices that the population as a whole share. A vocal segment of the country's population has been supporting what they see as the military's efforts to protect the country and keep the population safe. And the NLD seems to have calculated that challenging the military on this would be politically risky. Given the NLD's larger goals of trying to reduce military power and keep itself in power, there's little incentive to take this on. Nevertheless, the NLD government has said it will carry out the recommendations made by the Kofi Annan Commission on Rakhine State. These include ending restrictions on Rohingyas' freedom of movement, creating opportunities for Rohingya to obtain secure residence and a pathway to citizenship, and stimulating economic development in the state. To achieve this would require a sea change in local authorities' attitudes, in security forces' behavior, and in the central government's commitment to see it through. So finally, I want to talk about the Constitution. Does it provide any protections for religious minorities? Well, it really depends on how it's interpreted. So Article 34 and Article 364 do seem to provide some protective guarantees, but in practice, these have not been implemented. At the same time, there are other articles which can be read as contradicting the previous two. Article 361 recognizes the special place of Buddhism, and Article 363 states that the Union may assist and protect the religions it recognizes to its utmost. The inclusion of "to its utmost" seems to call for extensive state engagement in the religious sphere, and given the current and historical narratives about Buddhism requiring state protection, this could be interpreted as meaning the state can do whatever it feels is appropriate to support and protect Buddhism. Nevertheless, the clause could also be read as meaning the state has an obligation to protect religious minorities. Between 2011 and 2017, religious minorities have not organized campaigns calling for recognition of their constitutional rights, nor have any such cases been brought to the Constitutional Tribunal. This is for several reasons. First, few citizens have read the Constitution or know what it says about religion and citizenship. Second, as already noted, the Constitution contains ambiguous language regarding religious promotion and protection. Third, people feel very little attachment to the Constitution because it was written under military dictatorship. Most do know that it contains a number of provisions that preserve key military prerogatives, and that in 2015, the NLD campaigned on a promise to amend the Constitution. Another concern, and one that at least some people in conflict areas are aware of, is that the Constitution gives the military the power to handle all military cases. Thus, military people can only be tried in military courts for any alleged crimes committed, and only if military superiors decide this is necessary. Bringing cases against military personnel, then, appears to be futile. Equally important, people do not feel much confidence in the judicial system, as cases involving religious discrimination by state authorities or fellow citizens are unlikely to end up in the lower courts either. One of Aung San Suu Kyi's campaign promises was that her government would institute the rule of law. But the judicial system still functions more like an agency under the executive branch than as an independent body. And this is particularly true with regard to politically sensitive cases. Some religious minorities who experience abuse appeal to local authorities in their personal capacities to resolve the injustice. But because local authorities in many instances do not take action, a culture of mistrust has emerged, and many people feel that they have no choice but to remain silent. As one Muslim man from southeastern Myanmar put it, and he's not Rohingya, this is from another part of the country, "I have not talked about my suffering for 58 years. If we Muslims talk about it openly, I'm afraid that we will be assassinated by someone." While Muslims have been the primary victims of Buddhist nationalism, other religious minorities are also at risk. The structural parameters are the same: an emboldened Buddhist nationalist movement supported by influential people, and a constitution and system of governance that do not sufficiently protect religious minorities. Nevertheless, Myanmar has experienced periods in the past when religious pluralism was more widely accepted. So I'd like to end on a more hopeful note with this campaign, which started in 2015, organized by a civil society group. We can only hope that future political reforms may bring about a constitution and a government that does a better job of protecting religious minorities, and that citizenship and national belonging may be reframed so they are less tied to race and religion. Thank you.
Thank you all for keeping to the time and for these excellent papers. I thought I would open up the Q&A with a few comments. All 4 papers on Kashmir, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Myanmar show us that the problem of minority rights that has recently hogged headlines in South Asia was sought to be resolved, managed during the drafting of the constitutions of these countries. The papers show that the compromises envisaged by the country's founders, be it Article 370 in the case of Kashmir, the Objectives Resolution in Pakistan, the quick and early adoption of secularism in Bangladesh, or the differentiated kinds of citizenship offered in Burma, hardly proved adequate to the task of creating unified, equal societies. In the case of Kashmir, the question first arose in the form of how to represent Kashmiris in the Constituent Assembly. Would Sheikh Abdullah, whose writ operated largely in the valley, be allowed to nominate all 4, or would the Praja Parishad with some influence in Jammu be allowed to nominate representatives for Jammu or for the entire state? Mridu Rai also reminds us that political developments outside the halls of the Central Legislative Assembly influenced the positions taken inside. There was the then burning, quote, spectre of the plebiscite, unquote, which propelled some members to suggest dividing the state and holding zonal plebiscites instead. Nehru opposed such a division, but he too used the language of religion to emphasize Kashmir's criticality to the project of Indian secularism. Rai shows us how deadly such language is, which makes it possible for a range of politicians to insinuate that all Muslims in India and Kashmir were potentially fifth columnists. My question is, was it possible to conceive of a language of inclusiveness that, in the aftermath of partition and much talk of the two-nation theory, moved away from such compartmentalization while also acknowledging the fact of religious difference? This might seem like an academic question, but since this was during the drafting of the Constitution or special articles of the Constitution, it seems to have been a good opportunity to make a new, fresh start. Did anyone, Nehru, Ambedkar, Kamath, Thakurdas Bhargava, speaking and writing during the time of the incorporation of Kashmir, conceptualize minority rights differently? On Pakistan, Farnaz Isfahani describes the slow and then precipitous descent of Pakistan from being a state that included as many as a quarter of non-Muslims to a state where the constitutional amendment to exclude Ahmadis as Muslims has opened the door for the targeting of ever-increasing groups of minorities. I hope she'll forgive me for asking a quasi-academic question, but I would like her again to go back to the moment of constitution making and tell us a little more about the passing of the Objectives Resolution and the decision to, quote, define the state in Islamic terms. What were some of the compulsions faced by the state's founders, and was there space, democratic space, to have negotiated differences differently? How could Islamists who expected certain things from the creation of Pakistan have reconciled to a state that did not give preference to Muslims, that did not define the state in Islamic terms? Dina Siddiqui's paper reminds us how quickly the Bangladeshi constitution was put into place and how little debate there seems to have been during its drafting. It was the urgent imperative to have a constitution for a country rising out of a protracted civil war that was of supreme importance. That Bangladesh would be secular seemed so obvious so as not to be worthy of protracted debate. My question for Dina is, what did state secularism enable for Bangladesh as a newly independent nation? What did it actually mean to be secular in Bangladesh in 1972? How did this lived reality or experience of secularism change with the Fifth Amendment of 1979 and the 15th Amendment of 2011? She refers to the shifting machinations of the Vested Property Act and critiques the affective appeal of state secularism. But is there also not the danger of swinging to the other extreme in not taking into adequate account the space opened up by secularism to pursue other objectives, developmental objectives, for instance? Christina Fink's paper shows us how entangled the precarity of Rohingyas is with Myanmar's changing citizenship laws that are indexed to race and religion. The informal nexus of nationalist Buddhist monks and monasteries with political leaders rings true to recent developments in religion and politics across South Asia. So welcome, Myanmar, to the club. The fact that the 2008 constitution gives the military the power to handle all cases in conflict areas, including those of any alleged crimes committed by the military, reminded me of the Armed Forces Special Powers Act that has been in operation in Kashmir and parts of northeast India for decades. That the 2008 constitution drafted under military rule does not have the confidence of minorities is important to note. Fink concludes her paper on a positive note, suggesting that future political reforms might yet bring about a government that does a better job of protecting minorities. I would like her to tell us more about such a possibility, drawing perhaps on minorities' experiences and memories of the 1947 Constitution and the 1948 Citizenship Law. And I know she spent the summer, part of the summer in Myanmar, so I was wondering if she could tell us a bit more about talk of reform or conversations along such lines. I will end here. Perhaps the panelists will respond, or we can open up to questions and comments from the audience. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Ridu, do you want to go first?
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks so much for that lovely, very good question. A language of inclusiveness while acknowledging is different. The trouble is, if you look at the Constituent Assembly, there is, to refer to something that Nas Siddiqui brought out in her paper, if Bangladesh is not Pakistan, India is also. The Constituent Assembly is constantly trying to be not Pakistan or trying to be not what created. So it's remarkable. That's why secularism in some ways is yet something that is not, again, as Dina said, it's not included of the first draft. You'll remember that the socialist and secular were included in Indira Gandhi through the 42nd Amendment in 1976, I think, during the emergency. So again, there's a very rich attitude towards secular. But if in so far there is any addressing of religious difference, it is to erase and to constantly bring up that word secular and to remind anyone that religious perception is different. But we don't want to have what happened in Punjab happen again. Radhakrishnan, in fact, also has to say, look, our ideal is a common democratic secular republic. So let's allow some minority, and of course the minority, religious minority. But let's get rid of protections within 10 years. So, I mean, is really tackling what secular means. Uh, uh, it's trotted out whenever religion needs to be raised. And again, because Hindu majority, cultural majority country, uh, you know, the secularity of India is taken. I'll just say two things further, if I may. What is interesting is Article 370 creates all kinds of risks for Kashmir as we know. The article itself takes about pages of the Constitution. The appendices run into 26. Appendix 2 very interestingly sort of purposely suggests that the inserted word secular and socialist inserted by Indira Gandhi will not apply to Kashmir. So in some, and again, if you remember, Indira Gandhi becomes progressively less secular, she becomes less socialist, but finds it more important to insert those words in the preamble. So anyway, that's one. But I just want to tell you how incapable at some level the members of the Indian community had become of thinking beyond religious or craft category. In the meeting of the assembly on the 20th January 1947, Rajendra Prasad, before the beginning of proceeding, decides that he wants to share with the members of the Constituent Assembly the very offensive remarks made by Winston Churchill and Viscount Simon of the Simon and the great reply he gave to them. So what had Mr. Churchill said? He questioned the representatives of the Constituent Assembly. And he said, well, it's an assembly that only speaks on behalf of one Indian community in India. And Simon went up to him and he says, not just the community, but the caste inclusive. So, of course, this upset Rajendra Prasad very much. Now, his reply to Churchill and Simon, he says, well, I consider history in this occasion formally to state the fact. Out of a total of 20 members who would take part in this session of the Constituent Assembly, 210 members attended. Of these 210 members, 155 were Hindus, 30 were scheduled castes, 5 were Sikhs, Indian Christians, and so on and so forth. All right. Now, that's so pathetic because at the end of the day, he's still demonstrating or he's proving Simon's point that this is overwhelmingly Hindu and it's overwhelmingly caste. I would have thought that if anyone was thinking these colonial categories all over again, his response should have been, well, your parliament is majority Protestant. Do we call you unrepresentative? But that's not how any of them is capable of thinking about this issue. So I think it's almost a non-starter that people have said very pertinent that unfortunately was never debated in the assembly, and it's a great pity.
Right.
We've got speaking the language of religion. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, I'm going to give you a 30-second answer, and I think people must be very tired because I know when I'm sitting in an audience, I have a question, and listening to other people talk for 2 hours is really exhausting because no class goes on for 2 hours. So my very, very quick answer to you in non-academic language, since you made that little pointed reference, but I'm not ashamed of it exactly, is that Mr. Jinnah, what his idea was, this is a gentleman, a British educated gentleman from Bombay, the most cosmopolitan city of India and one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the world. His vision of what Pakistan was going to be and the ability to go back and forth to his own home in Bombay, he envisaged something very different. But did all of those who were along with him agree? People like my grandfather, he's written many books on, including letters between him and Jinnah, the Jinnah Isfahani correspondence, if you want to go back to the what happened. These were the people, there were some people who actually agreed with Mr. Jinnah's vision and were also, interestingly, from different minority groups, etc. But a lot of people, including Pakistan's first prime minister, it's not popular to say in Pakistan, but Mr. Liaquat Ali Khan, Pakistan's first prime minister, Mr. Jinnah dies. Here you are in parliament, the objectives resolution arrives, and what happens? Mr. Jinnah's vision is put to bed. It happened then. It was murdered then. So all those Islamists and people like Maududi who argued against Pakistan won on that day in 1949. So here was born a totally different and new Pakistan, of which a lot of us were not really ready to be part of, but had to be. So we're still struggling for Mr. Jinnah's vision. Anyone else have a question? For anyone, not just, yeah.
Oh,
For-
we're ready.
Oh, okay. For anyone, yeah.
My name is Sufi Lagari with the Sindhi Foundation. I see I want to see where is the fundamental problem. It's in the problem in the religion, or especially in Islam, or is the problem Pakistan founded from India? Then again, still continue the problem. You say the Jinnah was very educated man, so was the Musharraf was educated man, so was the Bhutto was educated man, so was Benazir Bhutto was educated woman. All were the educated foreign, but they actually has the problem in the constitution or problem in the religion. I want to know.
The problem was mixing religion and politics. That was the problem, right? So I see what you're saying. You know, as a Sindhi, in terms of your ethnic group, you are treated as less than other. The Baluch in Pakistan are treated less than other. When you start otherization, when you start saying this person is less Muslim than the other, then you start saying, oh, I'm from Punjab and these are the people. For example, in Pakistan, we still do not agree that what we did in East Pakistan led to the breakup, right? Or liberation, as the Bangladeshis call it. We're doing the same thing in Balochistan today. We're doing the same thing in Balochistan today. And Pakistanis tell me, I've just come back from Pakistan, tell me, oh, the army has to be in Balochistan and suppress those Baloch or they'll break away. And I'm like, oh man, why don't you treat them better, maybe like equal citizens? Let them get some of their rights and all of that. I mean, it's I agree with you. So once you start otherization, the process, it's Pandora's box. So there you are.
Yes.
Tom Timberg, consultant. There's a marvelous set of presentations, I think. The one thing that disturbs me a little bit is it's from the point of view, it is to some extent from a basically American and democratic legal point of view. Let me suggest the way in which countries other than the United States hasn't done so well on it, try to address these problems, which is as a matter of public policy. The locus of concern is often the Ministry of Interior, the Home Ministry, and its strategic items, the police, etc., how they control these things. I'm struck about Saudi Arabia and Morocco, both of which, on the one hand, are dependent on an Islamic identity for their legitimacy, but on the other hand, threatened by various kinds of Islamic militancy. What they do, of course, is they very closely control the Islamic clergy and Islamic organizations, and that is being mimicked to some extent in France and in the UK, a number of other countries, even the United States, often abroad. But as I say, this is a different locus. And the basic concept, I think, maybe people will try to argue against me, but I think the concept all of you have had in the back of your mind is you should have a constitution that provides firm guarantees of minority rights and a judiciary which will be independent enough to implement this constitution even against a parliamentary majority or a popular majority. And what's the more extreme, because it does not occur in the United States, those decisions by the judiciary will in fact be widely enforced. And as I say, I think that in many of the countries you're talking about, practically, the questions are a question of, if to the extent that a government can do something about these things, it really is a question of public policy. And I'm sorry, maybe next time we do this, you can get Ashutosh Varshney or a couple of the people who have looked at these same questions from the point of view of policy rather than law.
Well, this whole, I think this whole conference is on constitution. So that's why we're coming from, not because we're confused American-centric Democrats.
I'd like to respond to, actually. Yeah, I agree. I mean, you know, we're taking this particular slice today. But in Myanmar, your point is very germane. And what I want to highlight in the case of Myanmar is that, as I said in my slides, the military still has an extensive role in the government, and one of those is that the Minister of Home Affairs is an acting general, and so the entire Home Affairs Ministry, which is basically the administration of the country under the central level, is in the hands of, or is under the control of a general. And many of the people who work in the administrative services are retired military who are then seconded into the civil service. So this is extremely germane to your point.
Can I beg to differ? I want to just say that in India, there is a huge, there's a substantial investment in the constitution, and there's a groundswell of support for the constitution, for reforming certain aspects of the constitution. There's a robust debate, and it's not being driven by a US understanding of what the constitution is supposed to do, but it's, I think, deriving from a 70-year, sort of understanding, adoption of certain liberties afforded by the Constitution. I mean, it's a really lively debate, and it wouldn't be right to reduce it to the US's sort of interest in these matters at all. There's a very, yeah, I'll leave it at that. Yes.
My name is Ali Riaz, and let me put my 2 cents into this conversation with respect to this public policy issue and referring Britain, UK as an example. I beg to differ. Prevent has not prevented anything other than marginalizing the entire Muslim community in England. That's what it did post 9/11. So, I mean, with respect to seeing it as Saudi Arabia as a model, yeah, I have a serious reservation about that too. Nevertheless, the point is the constitutional guarantee in the context of maybe post-colonial state, but in large measure, the imagination of nation in this context, Pakistan, Bangladesh, to a certain extent Myanmar, definitely India, what we have seen is this enormous energy and necessity vested into this constitutionalism. That's why you cannot simply separate it from the public policy. And I just wanted to put this 2 cents so that it is recorded somewhere. I don't know where it is being recorded, that I sat there and didn't say anything. Okay, thank you.
I did, yeah.
Anyone else? Cassie. Yes, Cassie.
I'll clear my throat first. Thank you very much for these really fascinating papers and for the lively discussion that's already sort of taking place. what's one of the things that strikes me, and I'm sort of anticipating the remarks I'm going to make in the afternoon, which is always whatever it is. But I noticed that many of you, in sort of discussing religious freedom in your respective countries, have sort of highlighted a certain minority, but at the same time, possibly in your papers, in your presentations, possibly in discussion, the problem of other kinds of minority sort of definitions has come through. So in the case of Pakistan, right, where we've been talking about the Ahmadis, but on the other hand, we also have heard, just in the sort of discussion just now, that Islam Islam and ethnicity can also be merged together to minoritize, to some extent, different kind of ethnic communities, right? Sort of linguistic and ethnic cultural communities within Pakistan. And I think the same situation, perhaps, I don't know, might also apply in Myanmar. I wonder whether, and certainly in Bangladesh, we've already talked about the importance of different kinds of ethnic, linguistic kind of minority groups. So I was just wondering whether, as we think about international religious freedom policy, right, or sort of international policy, how we should go about approaching minority rights. So if we use a language of religious minority and focus on particular kinds of religious minority, are we, for example, reinforcing Buddhist nationalist arguments that identify, right, the Rohingya as Muslim, and not in terms of an ethnic community as they sort of desire? So I just wanted to sort of open up the question of whether speaking in terms of religious minority is best, or whether we might be trying to think about ways to open up and actually sort of problematize the boundaries of religious / ethnic, et cetera, kind of identities. So thank you very much.
Well, in the United States, religious freedom is a very, very particular right. And I would say it's as close to people's hearts and constitutionally as freedom of speech. Religious freedom is a very specific thing. You can talk about ethnic, you can talk about regional, you can talk about a lot of things. But religious freedom, which is perhaps a word which people, maybe conservatives, prefer to use, liberals prefer to use sort of human rights for the religious, whatever, minorities, etc. You can't shake this field. The field that I'm in is religious freedom. So you can talk about other fields or other fields that converge and can work with religious freedom, but you can't dilute religious freedom. It is a fundamental value. So I just want to say that, and that it's a fundamental value that's under attack all over the world, no matter what your religion is. So that's just my take.
Can I say something? Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, just very quickly. I think I totally agree with you, and I'm looking forward to listening to your paper this afternoon. I don't have any solutions. I think religious freedom, the concept, has a very specific genealogy, very specific history of people. And I don't think that can be so easily transferred to a post-colonial context, or at least it is very narrow, and that's part of what I'm trying to say, that we can't, if we look at that frame, as you point out, effectively we might, not everybody, it's very interesting, the Rohingya, for instance, don't necessarily think of themselves as Rohingya Muslims, right? It is the Buddhist national state, Buddhist nationalism that is constantly reproducing them as Muslims rather than as Rohingya, right? So if we're going to get to the problem, we can't stay inside a narrow idea of religious freedom as value, right? So opening up the category of what constitutes, at what moment in time, what state labels you religious as opposed to ethnic, which is, I think, the point I was trying to make out, is something very important. So this is not to deny that we shouldn't have religious freedom in the same way it's not to deny we shouldn't have secularism. It's just the categories with which we work, whether we work as academics or policymakers. And I don't want to make a huge divide between that, because I think our frames of thinking are really what undergirds our analysis. It's just we might use different kinds of language in different fora, right? So thank you for bringing that up.
Neeti? Yeah, can I just join in? Just again picking up from Kathy's question
Yes, please.
and Dina's response. I just want to say, completely, and I think, absolutely, these are categories that are formed through history, through politics in the field of politics, of religious politics. I mean, a Hindu rising Hindu right-wing movement, denies, for instance, seeks to deny that there's the categories like the Dalit, of course, and Muslim and Dalit get collapsed sometimes in the course of an internal othering. And I'd just like to bring this back also along the lines that Farhanaz did to the gentleman who asked, who was missing Ashutosh Vashne. These languages and these constructs are precisely the kinds of things that policymakers miss. In fact, policymakers often create the problems that they want to solve. And I think it's terribly important in some of these really niggling issues to keep policymakers out. I mean, they make policy, and the problem can only be the kind of problem that they can solve. So, you know, uh, I'm sure I have some admiration for Ashutosh Vashne, but I'm not particularly missing him in this debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Vikram Nehru. I'm from Johns Hopkins SAIS, and I believe the chair posed a question to Christina Fink, which she hasn't been yet given an opportunity to answer. So I was hoping she could be given the floor. Thank you.
Thank you for the reminder.
Thank you, Vikram. So how can we try to make progress in Myanmar on both religious and ethnic minority rights, I would say, or human rights more broadly with various different dimensions? But particularly when we're thinking about the current context of a Buddhist nationalist movement, I think, and violence in Rakhine State, really moral leadership is important. And we all expected Aung San Suu Kyi to be that moral leader. And for whatever reasons, some of which I discussed already, she seems to have decided that she doesn't want to take that role. So perhaps it needs to come from other people in society. That may be other people in her party. It may be other monks. Not every Buddhist monk is an ultranationalist. It may be from civil society. But I think we do need to recognize that the majority of people in Myanmar, there's a silent majority. There are people who don't agree with the Muslim-free villages, who live in those villages. But when people, local authorities and monks are saying we're going to do this, they often feel like, well, that's where sentiment is going, and I better just keep my mouth shut. And so how do we engage with that silent majority, or the people who are going along to a certain extent with some of these actions, but wouldn't necessarily have done this beforehand? At the same time, one thing that I think is important is information. And the state media, even under the NLD, we still have state media. And that is the main way that most people get their information, aside from Facebook. And so the state media really has an obligation to be providing accurate information. For instance, one person told me yesterday that among some informal workers, a survey, just an informal survey was done. How many Muslims do you think, what's the percentage of the Muslim population in the country? And people were saying 40%. The reality is it's 4%. So if people realize that the population of Muslims in the country is just 4%, maybe some of these fears could be recognized as overblown. And finally, I think that it is true that many people right now are really seized emotionally with this feeling of threat and fear, even though they're in the majority. And perhaps it does require diverting attention to other issues and maybe talking more about the broader ethnic peace process, and then later seeing how can this other religious issue kind of be brought in, reframed under a different type of language and narrative of peace in the country, which is something that everybody wants. Thank you.
Reza.
I have a mic.
Yes.
Okay, I'm loud enough, so.
The mic is behind you.
Okay. Thank you. Well, I would be talking in the afternoon session, but I think, first of all, a great range of papers, and certainly, I think one of the sort of constant or recurrent theme in all the presentations was this unfinished national projects, whether it's Myanmar, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and now, India has joined the club because there's a large number of people in India who want India to be a Hindu state or identified as such, and the constitutional debates are also pointing towards that. I think part of this turmoil, of course, the academics love to say that is the post-colonial anxiety and the unresolved fault lines that still have to be addressed by the elites in those countries through a genuine participatory state society contracts. And that partly is, to me, in the case of Pakistan, is a very clear example where the direction and the identity and the whole national sense of self is still an open question. It's under contest. And I think the second important thing that I really that was interesting was the opening up of the debate on who constitutes a minority. I think the Bangladeshi example is extremely valid, and I think we need to talk. We need to expand the term religious freedom or whatever we are debating this afternoon and morning, because one of the other problems in all these countries, South Asia, across, is how the ethnic or the indigenous peoples or the tribal peoples are otherized and kept as second or third grade citizens. In Pakistan, you have people in FATA, the area between Afghanistan, who still don't have equal rights. And they can be bombarded by Pakistani airships, by drone strikes. Basically, they don't have a recourse to high court. They have no fundamental rights access. So there's a constitution, and Farhad explained all the history, but it doesn't apply to those people and many other small pockets. And then I've been to the Chittagong Hill Tracts, and I met many people. They suffer from the same kind of exclusion. Within Dhaka, you have the Urdu-speaking Biharis, and they still live in a camp. It's been 40 years or so. And in India, the tribals and the indigenous. So I think these are the two takeaways from my perspective. Thank you.
Hi, so I'm Atif. I'm the intern for the program. And speaking of this policymaker stuff, two important policymakers we haven't talked about are Lord Mountbatten and Cyril Ratcliffe. My question is that, these two men played a big role in creating the boundaries that we know. My mother's side are originally from West Bengal, and they moved to Dhaka, and now we're Bangladeshi, so I'm a quarter West Bengali, quarter Indian. But this otherization that we're seeing, what role did these random borders, which were made at that time, and the lack of wanting to fix these borders, what role, and does it fester and play, and is it going to get worse? And I just felt like in this discussion, not mentioning these two people who sort of charted the course of independent Pakistan and India, what it would be like. So that was sort of my general question.
Thank you. Yes, there's a question there. Please, go ahead. The mic.
My name is Sabra Qureshi. I know you all are specifically looking at this entire huge debate from the constitutional slice of it. So that, as said by you, that sort of puts it into a very defined framework. But I just wondered, particularly in South Asia, but when we talk of religious freedom in the current scenario, how this, and as well as from the constitutional dimension, links with the increasing extremism that we see today in all parts of the world, but particularly in South Asia and in Pakistan, where we see so much more of it. How are we assessing those freedoms from a rise in religious extremism on both the majority and minority side? and how that sort of leads into the situation being what it is today. I mean, I'm just sort of giving to give an example. In Myanmar, it was a response to terrorist attacks by Rohingya extremists. And then again, sort of the backlash. In Pakistan, there are lots of examples again of how even within the different sects. So I'm just wondering how this whole thing is playing out vis-a-vis religious extremisms today.
I'm not going to answer your main question. I just want to say something about the Rohingya case, which I'm sure you know much more about. But just, I think it's important to think about narrative framings. And it is very clear from Christina's paper that there's a 40-year-old history of, or if not longer, of marginalizing of the Rohingya that comes into, takes on a much more stark form recently. So this idea that it was the very badly armed group of people who did attack a police station, that it was because of that attack that this so-called ethnic cleansing or genocide, whatever you want to call it, in Myanmar is happening, I think is to fall into a particular kind of discourse that is very problematic, that again covers over what's really happening. So just in the Rohingya case, I think one needs to be really careful about how stories are told, of what origins there are. And this is the Burmese government line. That was because whatever they're called, ARSA or whatever they're called, attacked, and so we had to go in. It's just propaganda, right there.
And I just want to try to link the two questions a little bit, because certainly the border between Bangladesh and Myanmar has been a main issue with regard to the Rohingya, because you have this population who now identifies as Rohingya, who are speakers of Chittagonian dialect, right? So for that reason, many people in Myanmar say, well, see, based on their language even, they're clearly Bangladeshi. But the reality was, before that border was created, this was a much more fluid territory, which had a mix of Buddhists and Muslims living in what is now both Rakhine State and in parts of Bangladesh. And you have Buddhist Rakhine who live in Bangladesh who are called something different, but anyway, they're Buddhist Rakhine, right? And so that all has been lost in the current narratives, right? That this is a population that, like the Buddhist Rakhine, are on both sides. And what's interesting, actually, is the Myanmar government has tried to recruit Buddhist Rakhine living in Bangladesh to move into Rakhine State and take over land where Muslims are living, and saying these people are welcome, but the people who've been living here for decades, who we're calling Bengali, have to go to Bangladesh. So clearly connected.
All right, we have time for just one more question, and then I wanted to end with a comment. Can we have the person right at the back, please? Yes.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Harun. So I just would like to ask a question about Myanmar issue, because I have interest on Rohingya refugee. I mean, I did a couple of research on Rohingya refugees. So my question is, I was also trying to find out what are the role of civil society inside Myanmar about Rohingya, Rohingya issues. Because I was trying to find out the role of civil society and also media. We know very well that media is, restricted by the government. But luckily I was following Myanmar Times for long, and I got one op-ed written by someone in Myanmar that mentioned that even Rohingya people, they cannot go to hospital because they fear that if they go to hospital, they will be killed somehow, because the hospital staffs are also involved with this killing process. It was written in Myanmar Times, an op-ed. So I was wondering, what are the role of civil society inside Myanmar? As you mentioned, and I didn't know that there is a silent majority who are against this process, because I was going through a lot of comments in Facebook or YouTube, and I didn't see any Myanmar people they mentioned, against this crisis. Thank you.
So, when we talk about civil society, it's such a complex arena with so many different actors. And I just want to highlight some of the civil society organizations in Rakhine State who are comprised of ethnic Rakhine, and they have been very proactive in driving Rohingya and other Muslims out of their communities, in policing their own communities, to not allow members of their own Buddhist communities, for instance, to sell things or take things to Rohingya communities. So they are kind of taking this on themselves to really exclude and, from their perspective, hopefully encourage people, Rohingya people, to leave the country. So that's one group of civil society. In the center of the country, you have a number of organizations who are kind of human rights, democracy-oriented organizations that we expected would speak out on this kind of issue. But because there really hasn't been moral leadership from the state, from the NLD, from Aung San Suu Kyi, and the threats from the people who are really excited or seized with this issue are so scary. People feel that they aren't protected if they speak out on this issue. So even those who may feel that what's happening is wrong, or at least elements of it are wrong, feel very insecure or vulnerable about speaking out on the issue.
I'm afraid we have to close for lunch. I just wanted to say, in closing, I'm a historian, but I think, as Dina said, to sort of elaborate the point, if you're looking at Burma, you have to look at a 40, 50, 60-year history. And the same is true for all of these countries. Right. And it's difficult to put it in 140 characters or 280 characters, but the problem is that we have to read more, and we have to be much, much more aware of the particular histories that inform each of these cases of religious extremism. And they're not all the same, and they cannot be brushed with the same broad brush of Islamic fundamentalism or Buddhist fundamentalism. We have to do the hard work of actually understanding what the case in each of these countries. Please join us for lunch, and I hope you can continue talking to the speakers and stay for the afternoon session as well. Again, if you're live tweeting, it's Religious Freedom in South Asia. That's the hashtag. Thank you so much.